The earth was still weeping. 2 days had passed since the Great Slip, as the local news was already dubbing the localized catastrophic mudslide that had sheared off the lower third of the exclusive Sterling View estates. The damage wasn't just cosmetic. 3 of the glass and steel mansions were condemned, perched precariously over a sheer, raw wound in the hillside. And the multi-million-dollar infinity pool of Victor Sterling, the HOA chairman, was now a jagged, concrete graveyard 50 feet down the ravine. But the worst part, for Elias Thorne, wasn't the destruction. It was the absolute, blinding focus of blame that had been instantly and surgically directed at him. Elias stood on the worn, moss-covered porch of the cabin his great-grandfather had built with rough-hewn pine logs 80 years ago. His property, a small pocket of true wilderness protected by dense, old-growth forest, sat on the only stable ridge above the disaster zone, acting like a natural breakwater. Yet, the official narrative, already solidified by a dozen alarmist news reports parroting the HOA's press release, was that the antiquated, unregulated drainage ditch on his land had overflowed, a supposed environmental hazard, acting as the catalyst for the entire catastrophe. Black SUV with tinted windows, clearly not local law enforcement, slow-crawled up the dirt path and stopped 20 feet from his fence line. A woman emerged, sharp and severe in a tailored charcoal suit, her expression one of utter disdain for the very air she was breathing. She carried a slim, expensive briefcase and did not smile. "Mr. Thorne?" she called, her voice thin and acidic. Elias stepped off the porch, his faded flannel contrasting sharply with her corporate armor. "Depending on who's asking. My name is Lena Harding. I represent the Sterling View Homeowners Association and Mr. Victor Sterling personally. I have a cease and desist order and a civil suit filing for you." She held out a stack of documents bound with a thick rubber band. She didn't cross the property line. "You are ordered to cease all activity on this land, effective immediately. The preliminary report identifies your property's grossly inadequate water management system as the primary contributing factor to the mudslide." Elias didn't take the papers. They fluttered in the sharp wind between them. "You mean the creek bed my family managed for 80 years without a single incident? Before your clients clear-cut the entire southern slope and piled up 20,000 cubic yards of uncompacted fill dirt to create their view?" Harding's face remained a blank mask of legal entitlement. "That accusation is baseless. The topography of their property was engineered by licensed professionals. Your derelict ditch, however, created a runoff bottleneck, diverting a catastrophic volume of water onto the newly graded slope. Their experts will prove negligence. We are seeking immediate emergency injunction to secure, stabilize, and if necessary, remove your entire structure to prevent further environmental damage. Remove his home. The casualness of the threat was a physical blow. You're talking about tearing down a structure that stood here before your boss was even born, built on solid granite because the million-dollar shacks he built on a foundation of sand started to slide," Elias said, his voice low, the contained fury making the air tense. "I advise you to retain counsel, Mr. Thorne. You have an emergency hearing in 48 hours. And I have another appointment." She dropped the stack of documents right where she stood, pivoting on her heel with calculated finality, the sound of the thick paper hitting the wet dirt echoing louder than the distant sirens. The emergency town hall meeting that evening was less a civic discussion and more a public execution. It was held in the cramped, overheated community center, packed with red-faced HOA residents, reporters with too bright camera lights, and the few grim-faced, long-time locals who still remembered what the mountain looked like before the developers arrived. Victor Sterling, immaculate in a custom-made suit despite the disaster, stood at the podium. He was a man whose confidence had been forged in aggressive boardroom battles, and he looked less like a victim and more like a general rallying his troops. What we saw this week was not just an act of nature. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sterling boomed, his voice amplified by a cheap microphone that still made him sound authoritative. It was a preventable tragedy. Preventable by simple compliance and basic maintenance. He swept a hand dramatically toward the back corner where Elias stood, Arms crossed, the target of every hostile glare in the room. Mr. Thorne's property, Sterling continued, his tone shifting from rallying cry to mournful authority, has for decades operated outside of the environmental compliance standards that the rest of us abide by. His private, primitive drainage system failed spectacularly under pressure, unleashing a torrent that undermined the stability of the entire Sterling View development. Our engineers are clear. Had the water been properly managed upstream, we would not be here tonight. A chorus of angry assent rippled through the HOA members. "He needs to pay," someone shouted. "Get him out!" Elias stepped forward, his knuckles white. "That is a lie, Victor. And you know it." The room went quiet, then erupted in fresh hostility. "Order! Order!" The mayor tapped a gavel uselessly. Sterling smiled, a slow, predatory curve of his lips that never reached his eyes. "Mr. Thorne, this is neither the time nor the place for unfounded emotional outbursts. The facts are indisputable. Your property is the source of the floodwaters that destroyed millions of dollars in infrastructure and nearly took lives." "The facts," Elias countered, ignoring the shouts, locking eyes with Sterling, "are that your company stripped every tree from that hillside and replaced them with shallow-rooted ornamentals. The facts are that you built 2 stories of concrete on land explicitly marked high erosion risk and used cheap, uncompacted clay fill to level your lots. You didn't waterproof the mountain, Victor. You just paved over the evidence." Sterling laughed, a dry, dismissive sound. "A sentimental woodsman's theory versus geotechnical reports from the best firm in the state. I think we know which holds up in court, Elias." He paused for dramatic effect, leaning into the microphone. "The truth is, Mr. Thorne is holding on to a derelict 80-year-old cabin that serves as nothing more than a time bomb for this entire community. We are simply asking the county to defuse it." The mayor, sensing the political expediency of throwing Elias to the wolves, cleared his throat. "Mr. Thorne, while your passion is noted, the consensus of the preliminary environmental assessment does indicate serious concerns about your property's ability to handle runoff. The county planning office will be issuing a mandatory closure order for the time being. Mr. Sterling, you are now recognized to discuss the proposed emergency assessment fund." Elias didn't wait for the rest. He had come here hoping for dialogue, but found only a well-orchestrated ambush. As he pushed his way out, brushing past Sterling's smirking neighbors, he didn't feel defeated. He felt crystallized. They wanted to take his home, the land his blood was in, and they were using a disaster they caused as the weapon. Back at the cabin, the sun had set, and Elias was working by the harsh beam of a headlamp. He had retrieved the legal papers. They were thick, confusing, and full of jargon, but the core demand was crystal clear. Eviction and demolition within 14 days, pending the emergency injunction. Elias pushed the papers aside and grabbed his shovel. Forget the legal maneuvering for now. Sterling's geotechnical reports meant nothing if he could prove that the construction itself was structurally flawed. He knew the creek bed on his property was solid. His grandfather had lined it with native stone. The real failure had to be where the creek officially entered the culvert managed by Sterling View Estates, the point of transition, deep down the hillside where the old-growth forest ended and the manicured, unstable slope began. He hiked down the steep, slick trail, skirting the caution tape. The air smelled of mud, ripped-up roots, and fear. The devastation was horrific. Where the 3 collapsed mansions had stood, there was now only the scar of the earth. Like a giant claw had scraped the face of the hill. Elias reached the area where the main storm drain, Sterling View's supposed professional system, had failed. It was a massive concrete culvert, now half crushed by the weight of the mud. Sterling had blamed the volume of water, but Elias noticed something else. He scraped the headlamp across the base of the culvert where it met the retaining wall. The wall wasn't tied into the bedrock as it should have been. It was resting entirely on a deep layer of fill dirt, and the water had clearly found its way between the concrete slab and the earth beneath. But it was what he saw on the retaining wall itself that made his breath hitch. Just above the mudline, partially obscured by a patch of resilient moss, was a faded, half-erased spray-painted mark, Max Fill plus 12ft, compact and tie-in. Elias quickly took a series of photos with his old phone, zooming in on the weathered mark. It was a clear, unambiguous instruction from an earlier construction phase, likely from the original legitimate site survey, an instruction that had been explicitly ignored. The fill dirt was far too deep, and there was no tie-in. Sterling had simply stacked the earth and hoped it would hold. As he was documenting the evidence, his phone buzzed. It was a notification from the courier service. Legal document delivered to your mailbox. He already knew what it was, the formal court order, but the real shock came. The rotating yellow beacon swept across the ridge, momentarily painting the massive, jagged scar of the mudslide in sickly, artificial light. Elias Thorne didn't wait. He scrambled up the slick, root-laden embankment, clutching the flimsy, mud-stained laminated blueprint like a winning lottery ticket and a death warrant all at once. The security truck on the crest of the hill didn't follow him down. They didn't need to. They only needed to know he was down there, poking around the wreckage, confirming that he was indeed the frantic, guilty party they'd framed. Back inside the rough comfort of the 80-year-old cabin, Elias spread the documents out on the thick, sturdy kitchen table, careful to blot the moisture from the crucial drainage override plan. His heart was still hammering against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence of the mountain. He wasn't a lawyer, but the schematic was brutally clear. A hand-drawn circle around the outflow pipe. A note in aggressive red ink. Reduce diameter to 30 for Lot A expansion. That reduction, cutting the pipe's capacity by a third, was the choke point. It guaranteed disaster when the rains came. He looked at his grandfather's old hunting rifle hanging above the stone fireplace. The urge to defend his land with the kind of finality that Victor Sterling understood was potent, but futile. This was a war of paper and procedure, and Elias was armed only with a shovel and a single damning blueprint. He had less than 48 hours. Until the emergency injunction hearing, he knew one person who might listen: Clara. Hayes's law office was tucked between a defunct laundromat and a tax preparation service in the oldest, least fashionable part of town. The glass on the door was frosted peeling, and bore her name in crooked vinyl letters: Clara Hayes, ESQ. Elias had known her father, a gruff, honest local who had spent his life fighting eminent domain attempts in the valley, usually losing, but always with honor. Clara, barely 30, looked up from a stack of eviction notices. She wore a sensible, if slightly rumpled blazer, and the exhausted expression of someone fighting too many unwinnable battles. "Elias," she said, rising, "I saw the news. I'm so sorry. I know Victor Sterling is trying to turn you into a sacrificial lamb for that disaster. He's not trying, Clara. He is doing it. And he's trying to steal my home to pay for his mistake." Elias placed the stack of documents, the lawsuit, the injunction, the photos, and the precious, damning blueprint, onto her desk. Clara's practiced sigh of resignation stopped dead when her eyes fixed on the title of the laminated drawing: Drainage Override Plan. She picked it up, her expression shifting from professional sympathy to professional shock. She traced the red ink notation with a nervous finger. "Elias, this is huge," she whispered, her voice tight. "If this is legitimate, this proves not just negligence, but intentional criminal fraud." They knew the risk. They prioritized square footage over stability. They created the choke point themselves. It was buried in the mud, right next to the wall they failed to tie into the bedrock, Elias confirmed, leaning over the table, his energy renewed by her reaction. That mark on the wall said, "Max fill Pleasant 12 FT, compact and tie-in." They went over 12 feet of fill and skipped the tie-in. "This plan tells us why." Clara rubbed her temples. "Look, I want to believe you, and this looks genuine. But this is an emergency injunction hearing, Elias. Sterling's lawyer, Lena Harding, she's an absolute shark from the city. They filed this to stop you from defending yourself and to get the demolition order before discovery even begins. We have no time for formal subpoenas. If we try to introduce this document out of the blue, Harding will scream unauthenticated and hearsay. The judge will side with the expensive geotechnical report every time. So what? We just let them win? We let them flatten my home?" Elias felt the cold grip of despair returning. "No," Clara said, shaking her head sharply. We fight fire with fire. We don't just use this as evidence. We use it as leverage. We need to verify that this override plan was never filed with the county. If it wasn't, that means every single permit they secured for Sterling View Phase 2 is based on the original legitimate drainage plan, the one they secretly violated. That's not just a civil mistake, Elias. That's a massive breach of state environmental and building codes. We need a bomb, not a footnote. Their focus was now split. Elias was tasked with proving the paperwork fraud, and Clara had to prepare for the court hearing. She knew they couldn't possibly win on technical merits alone. Elias spent the next day sequestered in the stuffy, labyrinthine basement of the county planning office, a place where decades of paper records went to die. He pored through the microfilm and dusty binders for the original Sterling View Estates permits from 5 years ago. He finally found them, stamped, approved, and officially filed. The drainage schematic attached was, as expected, the original robust version, not the fraudulent override plan in his pocket. The final permit explicitly stated that any deviation from the approved civil engineering plans required a 60-day review and refiling. Sterling had skipped all of it. But as Elias was making photocopies, the atmosphere shifted. A heavy-set man in a public works uniform, whom Elias recognized as a mid-level inspector named Gary, who had always been strangely deferential to Victor Sterling, approached the counter, tapping a clipboard impatiently. "Mr. Thorne?" Gary asked, his voice flat. "I have a directive here. Based on the mandatory closure order issued last night, I'm required to perform an immediate assessment of the stability of your cabin structure, including a detailed survey of the allegedly failed creek bed." Elias knew this was a direct play by Sterling to get eyes on his property, or worse, to confiscate the land under the guise of an inspection before the hearing. "I haven't been served a new warrant authorizing physical entry, Gary. The closure order is pending the court hearing tomorrow. You know that? It's a public safety assessment. Mr. Thorne, non-negotiable. If you refuse, I can call the sheriff and have them escort you off the premises immediately," Gary stated, dropping his voice to a hostile whisper. "Look, just let me in. I'll make it fast. Victor just wants to confirm the hazard before the judge rules." "Victor doesn't get to confirm anything on my land, Gary," Elias growled. "Tell your boss I'll see him in court. And tell him that if you set 1 foot across my fence line without a signed warrant, I will file criminal charges against you and everyone who authorized this trespass." The threat, backed by Elias's unwavering stare, momentarily stalled the inspector. Gary was a lackey, not a martyr. He frowned, muttered something about obstructing justice, and retreated, but the message was clear. The pressure was tightening. Elias returned to Clara's office late that afternoon. He didn't just have the blueprint. He had the evidence that it was a criminal fraud that violated core permits. Clara, however, was pale. She had just finished her final call with the court clerk. "They moved it," she said, pointing to a small, official-looking email pinned to her corkboard. "Moved what?" Elias asked, his stomach sinking. "The emergency hearing. It was scheduled for 9 a.m. tomorrow morning in Department 7. Now it's been moved to 4 p.m. tomorrow afternoon, Department 3, in the adjacent county courthouse. They used a spurious procedural rule, unforeseen scheduling conflict due to emergency caseload increase, to justify it." Elias slammed his fist on her desk, the fragile glass rattling. "They're trying to burn time. The injunction gives them the right to initiate demolition after 14 days, starting today. They want to delay until the last possible minute to cut off any appeal options we might have after the ruling. Or worse, keep us off balance." "This is dirty, Clara." "Yes, it is," she agreed, but her eyes held a spark of grim determination. "But they also gave us something, a chance to pivot. We're not arguing the drainage anymore, Elias. We're arguing the fraud. They filed the injunction on the basis of protecting the public from your failure. We are going to expose the fact that the failure was theirs, and that they are using the court to cover up a felony." Clara leaned forward, her voice dropping to a fierce, strategic whisper. "We go to that hearing, but we don't talk about the mud. We talk about the permits, we talk about the fill, and we use that override plan to blindside Harding and Sterling in open court. If the judge sees deliberate fraud to gain an illegal permit, They won't just deny the injunction. They might issue a criminal referral. That is our only shot at saving your home." Elias looked down at the muddy blueprint, then at the clock ticking down the final few hours. He was risking everything, betting his home, his land, his family legacy, on the element of surprise. As they finalized their plan, the phone rang. Clara answered, listened for a moment, and covered the receiver. Her face was bleached white. "It's the court clerk," she whispered, her eyes wide with a horrifying realization. "The judge assigned to Department 3, the one our hearing was just reassigned to. She's Victor Sterling's ex-sister-in-law." The adjacent county courthouse felt cold, sterile, and alienating. Department 3 was a narrow, wood-paneled room designed for quiet arbitration, not the high-stakes financial and ethical brawl Elias Thorne and Clara Hayes were about to enter. The gallery was thinly populated, a handful of reporters lured by the initial mudslide headlines, 2 stony-faced Sterling View residents, and 1 nervous-looking man from the Public Works Department, likely the Inspector Gary, forced to observe. At the plaintiff's table sat Victor Sterling, radiating sleek, tailored menace flanked by Lena Harding, who looked like she'd stepped off the cover of an expensive legal magazine. They didn't spare Elias a glance. Then, Judge Olivia Vance entered. She was impeccably tailored in her black robes, her gray hair pulled back severely. Her movements were precise, her voice a low, melodic alto that nevertheless chilled the blood. Elias noticed the subtle, almost imperceptible exchange of glances between her and Victor Sterling, a shared history, a quiet understanding of the rules of the game. Clara stood immediately, her hands trembling slightly, clutching a thin motion. "Your Honor, before we proceed, the defense formally moves for the recusal of the presiding judge on the grounds of potential judicial conflict of interest due to personal relationship with the principal plaintiff, Mr. Victor Sterling." Harding immediately shot up, radiating manufactured offense. "Objection, Your Honor. This is a baseless, slanderous maneuver designed solely to delay an emergency public safety proceeding. The relationship cited is a terminated, tangential familial link." Judge Vance didn't look at Clara. She stared at the ceiling for a moment, then back down. "The relationship is noted and is solely historical, Ms. Hayes. This court finds no grounds for conflict. Motion denied. We are here on an emergency injunction to address an imminent public safety hazard. Proceed, Ms. Harding." The denial was swift, final, and crushing. The game was rigged. Lena Harding smiled, a flicker of triumph crossing her sharp features. She launched into the plaintiff's argument, a smooth, polished narrative woven with technical jargon and emotional appeal. She painted Elias as a stubborn, reckless hermit whose outdated infrastructure acted as a destructive, pressurized water cannon aimed directly at the newly developed, environmentally sound Sterling View estates. "We submit," Harding stated, placing a massive, glossy photo of Elias's property on the exhibit stand, a photo taken during the height of the storm, showing murky runoff spilling over the creek bank, Geotechnical Report G44, clearly indicating that the primary hydrological failure point was the antiquated, unlined channel on the defendant's property. This negligence caused millions in damages and risks further instability if the derelict structure is allowed to remain. We require immediate court-ordered relief to stabilize the slope by removing the obstruction and implementing modern drainage protocols, the cost of which will be borne by the negligent party. She called her expert, a man in a crisp suit and thick glasses, Dr. Alistair Finch. Dr. Finch delivered a performance of clinical detachment, testifying that the integrity of the Sterling View slope was sound except for the external hydraulic pressure introduced by the bottleneck effect upstream, Elias's cabin property. Harding rested. It was a flawless, devastating presentation. Clara stood for the cross-examination, her jaw tight. She knew she couldn't beat the expert on hydrology. "Dr. Finch," Clara began, her voice steady despite the nervousness in her eyes. "In your analysis, you relied exclusively on the permit plans filed by Sterling View Estates, correct?" "Correct, counsel. They utilized standard, state-approved civil engineering designs, and those designs call for a drainage pipe diameter of 45 inches at the main outflow culvert, correct?" That is correct. Designed for a 100-year rain event capacity. And those designs also mandate proper structural tie-ins to the bedrock for all retaining walls on high-fill slopes. Is that accurate? Standard procedure, yes. Dr. Finch shifted uncomfortably, realizing where this was going. Dr. Finch, Clara pressed, stepping closer to the exhibit stand. Did you personally, physically inspect the current outflow pipe diameter at the base of the Sterling View slope after the disaster? Dr. Finch hesitated, glancing nervously at Harding. My team did a visual assessment. A simple yes or no, doctor. Did you measure the current broken outflow pipe? No. It was covered by debris, and my report focuses on the upstream causation. Focuses on the defense's property, not your client's, Clara stated, turning to the judge before Harding could object. Your Honor, the defense has no expert, no budget for high-end engineers, but we have the physical evidence of criminal deception. We request permission to introduce one and only one piece of evidence that disproves the entire basis of the plaintiff's filing, bypassing the need for an expensive and time-consuming evidentiary hearing that Mr. Sterling has attempted to delay until the last moment. Judge Vance, annoyed by the procedural maneuvering, leaned over the bench. Ms. Hayes, you may present your argument, but I will not tolerate unauthenticated conjecture in this emergency hearing. Understood. Your Honor? Clara turned to Elias. He placed the heavy folder containing the original, approved county permit plans on the table, side by side with the mud-stained, laminated drainage override plan he had retrieved from the landslide debris. Clara's voice rose, cutting through the silence. The plaintiff claims their plans are standard, state-approved. They are based on this document. She tapped the approved county plan. 45-inch pipe, standard tie-ins. However, the integrity of this filing is a lie. The disaster was not caused by external runoff. It was caused by an internal, deliberate choke point created to illegally expand a single lot. We submit this document, the plaintiff's own unfiled, unauthorized override plan showing a clear handwritten directive, reduce diameter to 30 for lot expansion. The courtroom erupted. Victor Sterling's mask of composure shattered. He bolted half out of his chair, his face blotched red, stammering, "That's forged! It's garbage! Hearsay!" Harding was on her feet, shouting, "Your Honor, this is an egregious violation of evidence procedure! This document is unauthenticated trash. We move to strike!" Judge Vance hammered her gavel 3 times, her face expressionless but her jaw muscles visibly working. The silence she commanded was heavy with her own personal crisis. She had to rule on a direct exposure of her ex-brother-in-law's felony. Order. Mr. Sterling, sit down. Ms. Harding, your objection is noted, but this is an emergency proceeding where time is of the essence. While the defense's evidence is highly irregular, the claims made here, of unfiled permit deviations, are grave and touch upon the very nature of the stability hazard this court is tasked with addressing. She held up a hand to stop Harding's fresh protest. Elias watched Victor Sterling sink back into his chair, breathing hard, his eyes spitting pure venom at Elias. The judge settled back, her voice now dangerously low. This court cannot, on an emergency motion, rule definitively on criminal fraud or the authenticity of this document. However, this court also cannot ignore a direct, documented challenge to the structural integrity of the plaintiff's core construction permits. She looked directly at Elias and Clara, her eyes cold as polished stone. Therefore, the court will not grant the emergency demolition injunction at this time, but neither will it deny the possibility of hazard on the defendant's land. She brought the gavel down one final. Resounding time, issuing the ruling. The plaintiff's motion for immediate demolition is denied. However, based on the conflicting evidence of structural stability across the entire slope, this court issues an immediate order for a state-appointed geological review. An independent state engineer will assess both the defendant's drainage system and the plaintiff's culvert capacity and retaining wall foundation. The findings will be conclusive for the permanent injunction trial. Clara slumped slightly, but Elias felt a rush of adrenaline. They hadn't won, but they hadn't been crushed, and the demolition was stopped. Then, Judge Vance delivered the final, calculated blow, the one designed to crush Elias financially and procedurally. Given the emergency nature and the equal claims of hazard on both properties, the initial retainer for the independent geological review, totaling $80,000, shall be shared equally. The defendant, Mr. Thorne, is ordered to deposit $40,000 with the court registry by 5 p.m. 3 days from now. Friday, or the original emergency injunction remains in effect. Elias stared. The air knocked from his lungs. $40,000. It was a toll he couldn't possibly pay, a procedural death sentence delivered under the guise of balanced justice. He had saved his home for 3 days, but unless he could conjure a small fortune from the air, the corrupt system would win on Friday, not because of the mudslide, but because of the bank account. Victor Sterling, now perfectly composed, leaned toward Harding and let out a soft, satisfied chuckle. The look he gave Elias was triumphant, mocking the hard-won victory of the truth. The cabin felt cold and hollow, suddenly too small for the weight of the debt Elias Thorne carried. $40,000. It was a sum designed not to achieve justice, but to price it out of reach, a legal guillotine set for Friday at 5 p.m. Monsieur Elias sat at his grandfather's sturdy kitchen table, the court order demanding the deposit resting beneath the faded, fraudulent override plan. Clara Hayes was frantic, pacing the small space, phone pressed to her ear as she argued, fruitlessly with the court clerk about the impossibility of the deadline. It's punitive, not procedural. It violates due process. No, I understand judicial discretion, but this discretion is fatally flawed. She slammed the phone down, her professional resolve momentarily cracking. It's deliberate, Elias, Clara confirmed, running a hand through her hair. Sterling used his connection to the judge to issue a perfectly legal, procedurally sound death sentence. We can file an emergency appeal on the financial hardship, but that takes weeks. Time we don't have. By the time an appeal is heard, the deadline will pass, and the original demolition injunction will be active. We need the money now. We need a miracle, Elias corrected, walking to the wall and pulling down a framed black-and-white photograph of his grandfather, a man with Elias's own fierce eyes, holding a newly felled pine log in 1947. My family never took a loan against this land. We never needed to. We built our lives with what we had. We have to break that tradition, Elias, Clara urged. We need a neutral party, someone outside of Victor's influence who sees the value here beyond the development potential. You have valuable old-growth timber, but that takes months to appraise. We need liquid cash guaranteed by collateral that can be instantly verified. The idea gnawed at him. Selling off a piece of the ridge, allowing a right-of-way, compromising. The sanctuary his family had defended for generations. It felt like a defeat worse than the demolition itself. But it was the only road left that didn't involve ceding his home to Sterling. Elias had one last connection that Victor Sterling couldn't touch, the regional chapter of the Cascadia Watershed Conservancy, CWC. For years, they had unsuccessfully offered to buy a conservation easement on his old-growth timber, seeing his property as a vital link in the native forest canopy and a natural water filtration zone. He drove 30 miles into the neighboring county, the mud-caked wheels of his old pickup protesting every turn. He met with the Conservancy's director, an elderly woman named Martha, in a coffee shop that smelled faintly of old books and dried leaves. $40,000 for an easement that closes by tomorrow? Martha repeated, her voice skeptical, yet intrigued. Elias laid out the situation with brutal honesty. The lawsuit, the override plan, the fraud, the judge, and the impossible procedural trap. He didn't just ask for a handout, he asked for a strategic partnership. Victor Sterling wants my land gone because it's the only uncorrupted piece of forest on that whole slope. By taking a conservation easement on the watershed area, you guarantee protection of the headwaters and the stability of the ridge line. You make my defense your defense. The money isn't a fee, Martha. It's a deposit for a geological survey that will, I promise you, expose the instability of his entire development. Martha considered this, tapping a finger on the table. We, Have an emergency fund for land defense, but $40,000 is a significant allocation. If Sterling wins the permanent injunction, we lose the money and we lose the land. If I win, Elias countered, leaning across the table, his voice low and intense, the Conservancy owns the right to protect this ridge forever. If I lose, Sterling paves over an ancient hidden spring that feeds the entire lower valley. I guarantee you that's next on his list. He's not just building luxury homes, Martha. He's taking a resource. A small fire ignited in Martha's eyes. She had been fighting developers like Sterling for 50 years, recognizing the pattern of acquisition disguised as altruism. We can offer $40,000 for a permanent, irrevocable conservation easement on the entire creek bed and the old-growth section of your ridge, provided you win this court case. We can wire the deposit immediately, but the paperwork must be signed, notarized, and filed with the county clerk's office this afternoon. The finality of the transaction was a heavy weight. Elias signed, his hand trembling only slightly. The paper was his salvation, but it meant he had sacrificed a piece of his family's self-reliance to the demands of the modern legal battle. With the transaction finalized, Clara immediately filed the necessary documents, the easement proof and the bank draft for the $40,000 deposit. They had met the deadline with hours to spare and secured their ability to move forward with the State Geological Review. But as Clara processed the final paperwork, something clicked. While performing a rapid high-level search of the CWC's title reports to finalize the easement, she discovered a chilling piece of information that redefined the entire conflict. "Elias, look at this," Clara said, pulling up an old abstract on her laptop screen. They were back in her small office. "When the Conservancy did their due diligence on your property years ago, they ran a deep title search on your land's mineral rights. It came back clean for timber and mining, but look who filed a specific title inquiry 2 years ago, right before Sterling View Estates Phase 2 began construction." The name jumped off the screen in bold text: Sterling Development Group, LLC. "He was trying to secure the mineral rights under my land?" Elias frowned, leaning closer. "Why? There's no gold, no timber of commercial value left, just granite and water." Clara clicked another link, pulling up a highly technical, old geological survey from the 1960s, commissioned by the State Highway Department. The section on Elias's specific ridge was highlighted. She pointed to a line of text that had been entirely irrelevant to the old survey, but now felt like a revelation. "Anomaly noted. Significant subterranean hydrological dome structure confirmed directly beneath the former Thorne homestead. High natural artesian pressure. Potential geothermal exchange feasibility not explored." Elias felt a cold dread settle in his chest, far worse than the fear of demolition. "A hydrological dome? What does that mean, Clara?" "It means your cabin isn't just on a stable piece of land, Elias," Clara whispered, her eyes wide with shock. "It means your entire property, the exact footprint of your old cabin, is sitting directly above a massive pressurized underground water reservoir. And judging by the geothermal note, that water is likely hot, mineral-rich, and commercially invaluable." She looked up at him, the implications of the discovery hitting them both simultaneously. "Victor Sterling didn't just want your land for the view or to cover up the mudslide. He needed to destroy your cabin to get rid of the legal claim to the surface land, clearing the way to drill and access what's underneath. He didn't want to stop the water. He wants to tap it. The mudslide was an accident that became a convenient opportunity. The $40,000 geological review he forced? He's hoping the state engineer will confirm the hazard leading to demolition and simultaneously confirm the value of the water source for his next, far larger play, Sterling Springs Resort, or a private utility takeover. Elias clenched his fists until his knuckles were white. The entire legal battle was a smokescreen. His home was not a hazard. It was an obstacle to a resource grab that could net Sterling hundreds of millions of dollars. The emotional stakes had just escalated to an existential level. They weren't fighting an HOA anymore. They were fighting a corporate conspiracy for control of the mountain's lifeblood. Sterling knew. He had always known. That evening, the local news ran a brief segment confirming the successful deposit of the $40,000 retainer and the upcoming state geological review. Elias had survived the legal ambush. The very next morning, Elias awoke not to the gentle sounds of the forest, but to the crushing roar of diesel engines. Victor Sterling was retaliating, utilizing the procedural allowance to improve his damaged property. Heavy machinery was operating directly across the ravine from the cabin. Sterling, unable to demolish Elias's home immediately, was building his defense and his threat. Giant yellow bulldozers scraped at the raw earth, while massive concrete mixers poured thousands of pounds of reinforced steel and cement into the destabilized slope. Elias stood on his porch, watching in grim silence as Sterling's crew constructed a massive, imposing, iron-reinforced concrete dam and overflow channel, a proactive, visible show of force designed to box Elias in and physically intimidate him before the state engineer even arrived. The structure was a monument to wealth and power, a gray, towering shield against the mountain, built right up to the official property line. It wasn't just fixing the mudslide, it was a physical declaration of war, fencing Elias's small wooden cabin into its own corner of the mountain. Sterling was sending a clear message. You may have bought 3 more days, but I control the earth now. Elias looked at the brutal concrete fortifying the lie across the valley, then back at the small, fragile frame of his family cabin, sitting atop a hidden fortune. He had the truth and the deposit, but Sterling had built a fortress. The state geologist was due to arrive in 48 hours. The final collapse was imminent.